As an adaptation of a 50-year-old heavy novel, Japan Sinks 2020 serves as a nice reminder that you don't need to put an entire paragraph in your title to tell people what your story's about. In Japan Sinks into the Pacific specifically, after a series of devastating earthquakes rocks the archipelago and blasts the cap off Mount Fuji. Not the most scientifically plausible disaster scenario, to be sure, but a fascinating one nonetheless, that quite literally pulls the ground out from under the nation to see what remains. The concept isn't the only odd thing about this series. Japan Sinks 2020 breaks from a lot of disaster genre conventions, delaying narrative and emotional payoffs in a manner that's rubbed a lot of viewers the wrong way. It's a real love it or hate it anime, even more so than Masaaki Yuasa and Science Saru's work usually is, and the people who hate it have been pretty vocal about it. Personally, I'm squarely in the love it camp, and today I'd like to balance those voices out by explaining what I think makes the series great and also kind of important. That explanation will involve some spoilers, but beyond the first 3 episodes, the show's not really driven by surprises, and I liked it more my second time through, so I don't think they'll dampen your enjoyment of it too much. Still, if you haven't seen it and you want to go in totally fresh, you've been warned. Japan Sinks doesn't look that much like Masaaki Yuasa's other anime, but then neither do Masaaki Yuasa's other anime. What makes him so remarkable as an animator, and Science Saru's productions so special, is a constant drive to explore and experiment with different styles and techniques. You won't find many anime from the same creator that look more different from one another than Kaiba, Kemonozume, Tatami Galaxy, Ping Pong, Devilman Crybaby, and Eizouken. In his filmography, Yuasa's paid tribute to everything from the bouncy rubber-limbed dancing of Golden Age animation to the unmistakable genius of Miyazaki. Here, we get to see his and co-director Pyeongang Hao's take on Shinkai-style pseudo-photorealism. It features meticulously detailed backgrounds that make the unprecedented destruction feel chillingly plausible, with equally meticulous lighting effects in important scenes that help to set a mood while grounding the anime-style characters in that high-fidelity world. Yuasa adds to that style the same thing that unites all of his shows and films, an uncommon fluidity of motion facilitated by loose line art and, from Ping Pong onward, by Science Saru's equally uncommon willingness to blend traditional animation techniques with digital shortcuts like motion tweening. You know a Masaaki Yuasa joint not necessarily by how it looks, though there are obviously some common hallmarks in coloring and character design, but rather by how it moves. Yuasa and his team have a remarkable ability to draw out the intricacies of human expression and body language from even the most inhuman character designs. The characters here, realistically proportioned and decidedly fleshy, take particularly great advantage of this strength, allowing the series to show, rather than tell us about, the bulk of their thought processes and emotional struggles. Combine that with thoughtful, evocative shot compositions and tight editing, and you've got a series that can say more with one episode's visuals than many do with a whole season's worth of dialogue. Admittedly, those moments of visual splendor aren't evenly distributed. There are a few episodes where the animation is noticeably stiffer and choppier than others.
What are you talking about? Such an asshole!
And while the direction and shot composition mostly makes up for that, they sometimes falter as well. Making this series back-to-back with Eizouken, and in the middle of an entirely different kind of natural disaster, seems to have taken its toll on the production. But even in scenes where the visuals don't quite hold up, Kensuke Ushio's uplifting musical compositions and Eriko Kimura's impeccable sound direction carry Japan Sinks forward, as they did in Ping Pong the Animation and Devilman Crybaby before it. The ambiance they create together is moving all on its own, making even totally still shots feel alive, and the show's finale wouldn't have a fraction of the impact it does without their work. Thankfully, the studio knows not to cut corners where it really counts. The disaster scenes, in particular, are consistently impressive and incredibly visceral. The series' earthquakes hit hard and fast, tossing characters around like ragdolls as the backgrounds break apart in real time. and the fleshy quality of the character animation takes on a gruesome new dimension when the survivors are confronted with the gore and carnage left in the aftermath. A lot of folks have been comparing Japan Sinks 2020 to Tokyo Magnitude 8.0 for self-evident reasons. While the seismic event in that series is objectively more realistic, with destruction modeled on computer simulations of an 8.0 earthquake hitting Tokyo, I'm struck by how much realer the quakes in this series feel. In general, the visual storytelling in Japan Sinks is much bolder and more striking than Magnitude's endless use of close-ups, but having just watched Magnitude with the initial intent of making this a comparison video, I don't think it does either series any favors to stack them up side by side like that. They're just two fundamentally different anime with fundamentally different narrative goals. Tokyo Magnitude 8.0 is a dialogue-driven drama centered around profound personal tragedies that occur against the backdrop of a city in chaos. Its scope is relatively small, focused on just a handful of characters whom we get to know intimately as they journey across Tokyo to reunite with their families. That basic story premise, which the series takes 11 episodes to explore, is covered by Japan Sinks in one action-packed pilot, with the remaining episodes expanding the series' scope until it encompasses, as the title suggests, the whole of Japan. There are undeniably similarities between the two. At the core of both shows is a sister-brother unit who grow closer through adversity, watched over by a tough but caring mother figure who ducks out 2 episodes before the finale. But Japan Sinks surrounds the Muto family with a larger, more varied and involved cast of characters, each of whom plays a role in advancing the greater plot. A plot that reaches well beyond the personal circumstances of the main cast. Japan Sinks' real story is about, well, Japan sinking, and how the nation and world respond to it. The series explores how the event affects different individuals and groups throughout the country, how it exacerbates and transforms existing social tensions, how the government tries to put a fair spin on deciding who lives and dies, after all the politicians and wealthy elites get to flee the sinking ship first, like the rats they are, of course, and how those left behind cope and struggle to survive. In asking these questions, the series seeks to interrogate and ultimately paint a complex portrait of Japan's national character, and also write some freestyle raps about it. Yuasa gonna Yuasa.
Yeah, hey, let's get it.
This falls right in line with the spirit of the landmark sci-fi novel on which the series is based, and between Japan Sinks and Devilman, it seems like Science Saru has a real thing for taking intensely political works of 70s genre fiction and updating their messages for modern audiences. Of course, one major difference between the two is that while Devilman Crybaby explored broad, global ideas about human nature and our future, or lack thereof, as a species, Japan Sinks 2020 is a story about Japanese society told from a Japanese perspective, and a lot of its social commentary is likely to be lost on people who don't share that perspective. Like the commenters on Reddit who watched the ending montage and thought it was an ad for the Olympics aimed at them, rather than a tribute to everything that would be lost in this disaster, meant to tug at the heartstrings of the people who'd actually be losing it. Now, my qualifications to discuss this topic are woefully inadequate as well. I studied Japanese for a couple years on weekends in high school. I've watched a lot of anime and done some cultural research to be a little better at writing about it, and I've been to Tokyo twice. I don't think I can provide anything close to a comprehensive breakdown of this series' themes and messages about Japan. My only goal in discussing them here is to show people with a similar perspective to mine that they exist and have more meaning than they might be aware of. Because I've seen way too many people writing this show off as lacking in complexity and depth.
みんなで写真を撮りましょう。はい、チーズ。
At the center of the series, we find the Mutos, Mari, Kojiro, Ayumu, and Go, representing a traditional nuclear family unit. In many ways, they embody important Japanese values, putting the group before themselves, looking out for their family first and neighbors a close second, and helping strangers in need when they can, particularly children and the elderly. In other ways, though, they pointedly defy traditional cultural assumptions. Kojiro, the father, works in construction as an electrical engineer and is a real man's man. He's also the family's designated homemaker, doing everything from preparing bentos for the kids to decorating their garden. Mari, meanwhile, who travels quite a bit in her work for a resort hotel chain, is the household breadwinner. She's also Filipino, making their kids, Ayumu and Go, half Japanese. And making them the protagonists is, in itself, a pretty damn bold statement. In an interview with the Japan Times, Science Saru's new CEO, An-young Choi, said that compared to even 5 or 10 years ago, you see a lot more foreigners in Japan. By making Mari from the Philippines and the leader of the family as they move forward, we wanted to portray Japan's increased diversity, as well as challenge traditional gender roles. It was a way for us to achieve better, more modern characterization. Mari, a former Olympic swimmer, is eminently capable and carries a lot of weight throughout the series, though not always gracefully. The emotional burden of the situation and pressure to keep her kids moving away from danger, especially after a tragic accident kills her husband early on, shortens her temper quite a bit. But she does her best to stay positive and stay the course, pushes the group as hard as they need pushing, and gives everything she can to help Ayumu and Go stay alive. This pushing doesn't sit particularly well with Ayumu, an Olympic hopeful herself, it kinda runs in the family, who had the misfortune of seeing most of her track and field teammates get crushed to death when the quake hit their locker room. In a panic, she flees from her dead and dying friends to search for her family, a decision that haunts her for the rest of the series, and it's not the only one.
嘘だろ。
2 days later, she watches her dad get blown to bits by stray World War II ordnance as he's digging for yams, all because she couldn't stomach the wild boar they ate for dinner the previous night. Survivor's guilt is a common theme in disaster narratives, and Ayumu's arc through this one sees her shouldering the brunt of it. She is a good person deep down, but that only means she's harder on herself for her perceived failings. The pressing needs of survival don't give her much room to openly wallow, though, so her only outlet for those feelings is to punish herself covertly while whining to her companions and treating everyone else with hostility and suspicion, though she does soften up as the series moves forward. Her brother, Go, is a lot more enthusiastic and friendly to the people they meet, even when they're not particularly friendly back. He's a gamer through and through, who's pinned his Olympic hopes on esports. He lives mostly online, talking to friends around the world, and dreams of moving to Estonia, the home base of his favorite YouTuber, Kite. He also likes to use English and Japanese interchangeably, something that's drawn a lot of ire from the show's detractors, many of whom have called it out for being cringy, unnatural, and unnecessary.
Fingers crossed. 何それ? 願いが叶う魔法.
I'll concede that not all of Japan Sync's English lines are winners.
Hasta la vista, baby.
And we'll get to Daniel, but as for Go, his distinctive speaking pattern actually highlights just how committed the series is to portraying different Japanese social groups authentically without stereotyping them. Yazzie spent a year as an exchange student in Japan, one that was ironically cut short by the Tohoku earthquake, and during her stay, she was hosted by a mixed Japanese-Filipino family, whose daughter, she tells me, threw around English words and phrases every chance she got, just like Go does in the series. And much like Go does in the anime, she faced a great deal of cruel, casually racist pressure to stop. It's not hard to see where Go's general disdain for his country comes from, besides the quakes, I mean. Later on, those social pressures very nearly get him and his family killed. The survivors meet and beg for rescue from a barge full of very loud Japanese nationalists, and after hearing Go use English, they decide to leave the whole Muto family to die because, well, they're a bunch of heartless, racist assholes. Luckily, a kindly fisherman shows up to offer them shelter in his boat moments later. And then the stupid racists, being stupid, run aground not 5 minutes later, blowing themselves to smithereens in the process. The message here is about as subtle as the resulting explosion, but it feels like a satisfying, if gruesome, moment of karmic justice for all of 20 seconds until the blast wave reaches the fishing boat, carrying shrapnel with it that pierces the hull. Because karma isn't really a major force in this narrative. Neither is human malice or cruelty, for that matter. There are some unambiguously shitty people in the show, including the expected apocalypse means no rules douchebag, but they all ultimately do more to hurt themselves than any of the survivors. For every asshole the Mutos and their friends meet, there are 10 friendly strangers ready to help them out. And I like that a lot. There's an undercurrent of misanthropy that runs through a lot of disaster fiction. Too many characters to count who react to the chaos by saying, "Fuck you got mine," and going full Mad Max overnight. Which is useful in crafting a conventional conflict-driven storyline, but simply doesn't reflect the reality that in moments of crisis, human beings are overwhelmingly inclined to go out of their way to help each other. In that respect, this is one of the most realistic shows of its kind out there. There are way too many friendly faces to cover in this video, so I'll be focusing on the ones who join the Muto family on their journey across Japan. From the start, that includes 2 of their family friends. Nanami Miura, a personal trainer who dabbles in martial arts, is spunky, cheerful, and outgoing, always eager to help others whenever she can. Haru Okoga, in contrast, keeps mostly to himself, tuning others out with his music. He was once Ayumu's senpai on the all-star track and field team, and apparently attained some fame with his skill, but the pressure got to him, turning him into a reserved, implied hikikomori by the start of the series. While the disaster has forced him out of his shell, seeing his mother die in front of him has only made him want to retreat into it more. The person who does the most to pull him out and help the rest of the group in general is without doubt Kite, that huge YouTuber Go likes so much, who meets the survivors by chance and joins them on a whim early in the series. Having stuck around because the disaster seemed interesting, Kite's the only rich person we meet in the show, and likely the only living one left in Japan, and the assets he has access to save the other survivors more than once. But the real asset he brings to the table is his positivity. He's always encouraging the rest of the cast, and for someone who initially comes across as literally above it all, eminently eager to make connections and be helpful. As you'd expect from a YouTuber, other than me, I mean, the dude's got charisma to spare, and his infectious enthusiasm prevents the series from being overwhelmed with bleakness early on. Probably the least immediately likable party member is that old racist guy from before, Kunio. He doesn't make the best first impression when he nearly kills Go with a bow and arrow by accident, and the later impressions he makes aren't much better, but he's clearly very distraught at the thought that he might have, and he does everything he can to make up for it. He does have a good side buried under all his anger and pain, but it comes out briefly and stays mostly deep down there until the very end.
悪い人じゃなさそう。
外人なんか信用できるか。
これ会社でしょ？
車と酒とタバコだけは別だ。
Ironically, if not for his ingrained distrust of foreigners, Kunio'd probably find a lot to discuss with Daniel, a Yugoslavian immigrant who loves talking about the subtleties of the Japanese language and the virtues of Japan's culture. Daniel represents weebs and is appropriately a bit cringy, particularly with his magic tricks, but he's also got a kindly, gentle presence that makes him hard to dislike. Around the time they meet him, the group also picks up, quite literally, a paralyzed man who turns out to be Professor Onodera, one of the 2 scientists who first predicted that Japan would sink. While he was widely ridiculed and condemned for his prognostications of doom under suspicion that he was pushing a political angle to hurt the nation, Onodera's research ironically holds the keys to its eventual revival. Also, for a man who can't talk, dude's sass game is impeccable. These characters, and many other supporting cast members besides, come and go as the series progresses, often going out, well, like you'd expect them to in a disaster show. Something that happens fast and frequently. Too fast for some people's taste. One complaint I've seen levied against Japan Sinks 2020 many times over is that its handling of death is overly flippant. More than once, important characters are killed right at the end of an episode, and when the story picks back up in the next one, the survivors have already mostly moved on, only thinking of those characters in their dreams. Critics have argued that this doesn't really give us as an audience much room to mourn these characters or even process their deaths, which hampers the show's ability to deliver tear-jerking tragedy and makes them feel kinda cheap. This assessment is, I think, correct. I'm an absolute sucker for sad anime, and in 10 episodes, Japan Sinks only made me cry twice. What I think the folk making these complaints are missing, though, is that the numbing sensation caused by this ceaseless assault of senseless destruction and death is kinda the whole point. And Nanami's arc up through episode 3 illustrates that quite well. Toward the beginning of the episode, she survives an attempted sexual assault, coming out the other side feeling stronger and more alive than ever. With her newfound courage, she approaches Haruo with a gift, a new pair of unbroken glasses taken from the attacker that aren't actually his prescription, but which he accepts nonetheless. Jealousy over the slow-growing, unspoken affection between the two causes Ayumu, already frazzled from the carnage in the locker room and death of her father, no end of stress. But right when the whole thing threatens to boil over into a dramatic love triangle, Nanami wanders a bit too far downhill, takes a bathroom break in a poison gas cloud, and suddenly ceases to be. And that potential plot thread is just cut short. Her character development and the love triangle rendered instantly irrelevant. And while Ayumu, feeling guilty that she harbored resentment over something so petty in this moment of unknown peril, tries to rationalize this as being her fault too, it's self-evidently not. As Kite says, she was simply lucky and Nanami simply wasn't. The same goes for her track and field friends. With everything in that locker room being tossed around like dye in a Yahtzee cup, her survival came down solely to where she happened to be standing the moment the quake hit. Likewise, her dad might have been totally fine if he followed a different yam vine or took another second to read the warning signs. Or her brother might have died there too if their mom had waited another second or two to ask for his help. The line between life and death is razor thin, and most of the show's characters live or die regardless of their choices or abilities based on a split-second roll of the cosmic dice. And I can see why someone who goes in expecting a more traditional disaster movie narrative where the forces of nature present a backdrop to human conflict and a challenge for capable heroes to overcome might be a little dissatisfied with that. Koichiro Muto's survival skills would make him the MVP of most comparable fiction, but here he's the first to go in a meaningless accident. And even if they did kill him off that early, most disaster movies or shows would really draw both his and Nanami's deaths out to wring some tears out of us, so it feels cold and almost inhuman that this one doesn't. But as Mari impresses on her sulking daughter when they're walking away from her husband's fresh corpse at the start of episode 3, that's kinda the cold, inhuman reality of this situation. There's just no time to stop and grieve for a few people in the middle of a disaster that's already killed millions, with death nipping at your heels and hiding around every corner. If you're still alive, your only choice is to keep moving forward and try to stay that way and stay together until you have the time to actually stop and process everything. It's nowhere near a direct equivalent, obviously, but if you've figured out how to look at a newsfeed in 2020 without breaking down crying, then you already know to some extent what that feels like. We are not meant to seek immediate meaning or catharsis in the series' many deaths, with the exception of one intentional sacrifice toward the end that is really given time to sink in, because meaning is something we find and create for ourselves and others as we live. For every second it spends lingering on the dead, the show takes a solid minute to revel in the desolate beauty the survivors witness as they trek across the shifting landscape of a dying Japan.
Let's go crazy!
Great shot composition, gorgeous lighting, and powerful music instill many of these scenes with a palpable sense of awe, which is a wholly appropriate thing to be feeling when staring out at something so beautiful that so thoroughly dwarfs the human cast and that could end any one of them in an instant without a care. For every time one of the survivors does meet death, there are 10 where they narrowly avoid it, and often the series' direction barely acknowledges the danger. Death and destruction are simply part of the landscape. When our heroes do at last find safety, we and they are given a chance to reflect on and celebrate the lives of the characters we met and parted with along the way. And while reactions to it may vary, that epilogue hit me like a ton of bricks, leaving me mourning not just for the characters I knew, but the millions I didn't. At the same time, seeing all of the survivors moving forward with their lives, working together to rebuild their lost nation better than before, filled me with much-needed hope in a time of global uncertainty. There is deep catharsis to be felt in this show, but only after the numbing terror subsides. Now, the series does lose some of that urgency in its midsection, an offbeat mini-arc where the survivors hole up in Shan City, the mountain compound of an oddball, pot-smoking cult. Many of the show's detractors have said this feels like filler, and while it has issues, marking a low point in the series' animation quality in particular, I fundamentally disagree. Yes, the pacing slows down here, but it's a moment of false security, where the characters are uncertain about and in plausible denial of the true scope of the looming disaster. So that lull before the climax makes a lot of sense. And the show cleverly reflects that uncertainty by setting up and then subverting the old apocalypse fiction cliche of a pushy cult with sinister ulterior motives. The seedy atmosphere of Shan City's after-hour raves and near-ubiquitous presence of illegal marijuana there, a contentious political topic in Japan to say the least, creates the impression that there's gotta be something wrong here. But when things do go wrong, before the big inevitable thing that is, it's only because an old, stubbornly violent traditionalist gets hopped up on very legal opioids, convinces himself a young boy the cult worships is his dead granddaughter, and goes on a killing spree to rescue her. Yet another potent political statement, this one only slightly undermined by how rad he looks doing it.
Deja vu, I just been in this place before. Higher on the street, and I know it's my time to go.
The moral divide isn't totally clear-cut, it never is in this show. Some of Shan City's administrators and residents do show themselves to be the greedy, opportunistic assholes you'd expect them to be, but most of the pot-smoking cultists are decidedly decent and helpful, and they're pretty reasonable about their religion, too. Our heroes are allowed to sleep in their yurts and partake in their food under no pressure to follow their faith, which is especially cool when you consider that the spirit medium they follow is demonstrably legit. Not exactly a realistic plot point, but if you're looking for pure realism in a Masaaki Yuasa show where a whole country sinks, you are setting yourself up for disappointment. That said, the most conspicuously ridiculous thing about the organization, the big ostentatious statue that serves as its headquarters, seems a lot less silly when you look at the very real peace tower built by Perfect Liberty Kyodan in Osaka. Looking at that also helps to contextualize how the arc fits into the greater narrative on a thematic level. The portrait of Japanese culture Japan seeks to paint simply wouldn't be complete if it didn't include the 10 to 20% of citizens who are members of the various Shinshukyo or new religions that have sprung up in Japan over the last 2 centuries. This specific one's fixation with kintsugi, the art of repairing and beautifying broken ceramics with gold lacquer, also has clear symbolic relevance to the show's ending, which sees the fractured Japan rebuilt into something new and beautiful. A transformation that's also embodied in Ayumu herself, who loses her leg to an infection shortly after being rescued, and with it her prospects of running track in the 2024 Olympics, but rebounds to compete in the Paralympics come 2028, running a hell of a race on a prosthetic leg with a notably golden socket. Now, the way she loses that leg is, I'll concede, a bit difficult to swallow. Ayumu cuts her ankle escaping the locker room in episode 1, and despite poking at it every episode, she never mentions it to her family or bothers to get it treated. Not when her dad's got the first aid kit out to treat a cut on Go's eye, or even later when she's taking care of the paralyzed Professor Onodera in Shan City's hospital. If it bothers you to watch characters behave irrationally, then this whole subplot may have you groaning at the screen, and honestly, I was right there with you my first time through the series, but I'm gonna defend this choice on 2 fronts. Firstly, it is not an unearned moment of easily preventable tragedy, but rather the setup for a final moment of triumph and catharsis. If the series expected us to feel sorry for Ayumu, that would be one thing, but she doesn't even feel sorry for herself. She works to overcome the problems she made. And that ties into my second point in this plot point's favor, that while Ayumu's handling of her wound doesn't make much sense from an outside perspective, it does make sense to her. She feels immense guilt over leaving her teammates to die in the locker room and sees the cut as her punishment for that. She thinks it's a burden she needs to carry on her own, and that irrational idea is only reinforced when her dad and Nanami both die doing things to help her. So in rebounding from the injury and choosing to continue pursuing her athletic dreams, she's both keeping the promises she made to her mom, her coach, and her friends, and moving past her own survivor's guilt. I think that makes for a powerful character arc, personally, and it's not the only one buried in the show's subtext. Haruo-senpai barely talks through most of the series, but we can nonetheless observe every step of his radical transformation from introverted loner to outspoken team player through his body language and actions. There are pros and cons to this show-don't-tell approach to character development. It's easy for viewers who aren't already engaged to miss key details and write characters off as being shallow or inconsistent, but if you are engaged, it makes watching and rewatching the series feel very rewarding, as there are a lot of less plot-vital details to be picked up on too. Like the fact that Kite is a trans man, or that old man Kunio gave up on his racism at the end there. While the characters are, I think, quite solid, Japan Sync's narrative logic can be a bit shaky at times. A lot of coincidences stack up toward the back end, some of which straight up save the cast from certain doom, and that can feel more than a little unsatisfying in the moment. Conventional storytelling wisdom says it's fine to create problems for your heroes through sheer circumstance, but they should always earn the solutions to them through their own effort and ability. That said, as plot devices, all these Deus Ex Machina moments and chance encounters do work to reinforce the show's central message. The world is always changing, nothing is permanent. Disaster can and will just strike out of the blue. So every moment you spend alive sharing this changing world with wise, kind people is an incredible stroke of luck. And to make the most of that luck, you need to keep moving forward. I'm not saying it's wrong to be put off by all these plot conveniences. I know I rolled my eyes when Kite rolled up out of nowhere in his amphibious assault vehicle, but don't simply discount them as being sloppy writing. Tight causal logic isn't the be-all and end-all of good storytelling, and personally, I have a hard time holding on to all those gripes when the show can make me feel like Beyond being able to stir up complex emotions, though, the anime I love most are the ones that give me a lot to think about. And if the fact that I've spent over 20 minutes rambling about it is any indication, Japan Sync's 2020 excels at that. It's a messy show, literally and figuratively, but only because it's bursting at the seams with interesting themes and things to say about life, death, our ever-changing world, Japan's place in it, and the increasingly diverse Japanese population's place in that. Like all of Science Saru's anime before it, Japan Sync's is a challenging, thought-provoking work of art that defies convention and embraces oddity. It may not be for everyone, but it's exactly the kind of show I made this channel to talk about. I'm Geoff Thew, professional shitbag, signing out from my mother's basement.